Well, today on No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen, the state of play, domestic scandals and foreign wars, arrive can spending. Canada writes a check for Ukraine, but is the West's betrayal of Ukraine just really becoming more obvious? Foreign interference by China in Canadian politics and others. And a British military expert says his country, and perhaps others, should be considering training up citizen armies. Meanwhile, we're having serious recruitment problems in this country. So we have gathered together an amazing group of people today. I'm so thrilled. Mark Norman, of course, the Vice Admiral with the Canadian Navy, former Vice Chief of the Defense Staff, and now he's a defense strategist at Samuel Associates, and he joins us regularly to talk about all things military and some things larger. Tasha Kheiriddin, a journalist, a policy analyst, and a lawyer. She also has taught a course on the intersection of partisanship and policy process at McGill's Max Bell School. These are the kinds of things that we're always really interested in. She's co-authored two books, works a little bit on the conservative side of politics, and spends her time in Toronto. And Margaret McCuaig-Johnston, she's senior fellow at the Institute for, get this, Science, Society and Policy at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, and former senior civil servant and considered one of this country's experts on China. So there is the gang. Welcome to you all. And I was going to start with all these weighty matters of war and international intrigue, but the Auditor General kind of put the whole country off track on this whole arrive can. I hate to even use the word scandal, but I don't know what else to call it. Tasha, dive in.
Where to start? Yes, Karen Horgan came out and she rang the alarm that should have rung years ago, because ArriveCan is nothing new. It began its life during the pandemic as a method of tracking people and their vaccinations when they travel to Canada, getting people to quarantine. There were problems with it consistently. We knew this. I think 3% of people who were asked to quarantine shouldn't have been asked to do so. There were glitches. Now it turns out that it's a lot worse than that. It was supposed to cost $80,000, and instead it cost $60 million to the Canadian taxpayer. It boggles the mind.
We're talking about an app on our phone that most 12-year-olds could build in about 15 minutes.
Well, yes, it went through 70 launches, which tells you how many problems it had. But it was also one of the bigger issues that she identified was it was this sort of Keystone Cops routine between different agencies, border services, the other ministries, even Treasury was involved. Like there were 4 ministries that were playing ping pong with this thing. But there was also behind the scenes a company called GC Strategies that received the lion's share of the payments. And they basically subcontracted the work to other people whom they admitted they inflated their qualifications. They said this in front of a parliamentary committee. So that company's now under the hot seat. There's other revelations that have come out about contracts it's had, but this is a giant mess.
And others are saying that there will definitely be more in the next few days. It's the kind of thing and that really that everybody can understand, and that makes everybody really angry when they see that level of waste. So do you think this one has legs, that we might even see numbers change?
Well, we are already seeing reporters digging in, like I said, to that particular company, and they found it's $258 million in contracts that this GC Strategies has received since 2015. And of the contracts they got, I think it was about 140 contracts, 46 of those were sole sourced. Most of them have to do with border services. So a lot of questions here as to why this essentially a broker of IT services, because they don't do the work themselves. They connect the government with other people. Why were they hired? Why was this outsourcing done? Why was it so costly? Million questions. So I agree with you. It's got legs, this story. There's all sorts of other stuff that's going to be dug up.
Just figuring out on a daily basis, I'm in the wrong business. I should be more of it. Mark, do you have any thoughts on this one before we move along?
Yeah, and thank you, Senator, for the invitation and the opportunity. Yeah, I think Tasha's raised some really good points there, and I'm going to avoid the political dimension of
Yeah.
this, and I want to look at this as a retired senior military officer, obviously very interested in uh, procurement, the government's capacity to actually deliver programs, and the impact these types of things have on public confidence. And I give you two observations. I think the first one is that sadly this just reinforces the underlying perception in the Canadian population, those who are paying attention to these issues, that there is this unfortunate systemic incompetence that permeates a lot of the machinery of government. And so let's park the issue of any malice or intentional fraud or anything like that, and let's just talk about the systemic incompetence that this particular series of events is indicative of. And then the second thing, which really concerns me more deeply, is the impact that this type of thing has and could potentially have on our institutional capacity to deliver, in this case, services, simple services, but more broadly, programs and capital procurement. And so I have a huge concern, not just with what this represents, but I government bureaucracy tends to be extremely reactive and extremely punitive when these type of things happen. And I'm already hearing indications from friends in the trenches that there's kind of a backlash here in terms of how contracting is conducted, how things are done. And of course, we're going to try and fix this now with a one size fits all implementation of punitive approaches, which are just going to further slow down our ability to actually get things done, which ultimately is what Canadians are expecting the government to do. Get things done, do it efficiently, and be responsible keepers of the public purse. So those are my thoughts right there.
It's a really important point because if we have to change the rules for acquiring staplers, it's also going to impact F-35s and ships.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the issue. Margaret, thoughts, comments?
Yes, well, I had a big role in administering programs when I was in the government, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of programs. And I can tell you that there are thousands of people across the government looking at their own program integrity and seeing what's happening here and learning all kinds of lessons of what not to do. This first broke in the Globe and Mail, and Bill Curry's been on top of this from day one. And there's a reason that public servants say something's going on wrong here in this program. What would this look like on the page one of the Globe and Mail?
Yep.
And often you will step back and say, okay, we've got to rethink this. One of the things that I've been watching is the parliamentary committee that's been investigating this. And they had some really substantive grilling of the various parties in it. And then they got a copy of the CBSA, Canada Border Services Agency report that they called scary. And so they stopped all their work. What? They stopped all their work when they found a scary report? It must have been, illegalities or something like that. Because that's really unusual. This
is the problem with government, with House of Commons committees, where the governments have majority. When things get scary, they often mean they're politically scary.
Perhaps. Well, the RCMP is investigating, and I wouldn't want to be any of the parties in this one.
It's kind of ties to the next point, Margaret, about what people are generally calling kind of a culture of secrecy around a lot of issues, and that has certainly been the case on the foreign influence on the Canadian political process by the Chinese and others. But that's really where the profile has been. Are you finding the same thing?
Yes, and what's really disturbing there is those of us who work on China had a very good understanding of what that country was doing broadly in the world and within Canada, until we had those national security leaks. And it was day after day after day, more revelations of, MPs potentially getting indirect money, people being bussed into voting areas, and, a lot of really seriously concerning things, especially looking into the backgrounds of parliamentarians so that they could put pressure on their Chinese relatives back in China or Hong Kong. And, this, I had no idea. And if it hadn't been for those national security leaks, we would still be oblivious. So that did launch a process to try to investigate. The first thing that the Prime Minister said on the very first leak was, our top priority is to catch the leakers. And so far, we haven't seen any of them, as far as we know, unless it's being done very quietly behind the scenes.
I think that's what everybody keeps asking in all these issues, a little bit of a sidetrack here, which is who pays the price when this stuff is uncovered? Who loses their job because of this kind of stuff? And we don't hear it. Tasha, on the China file and the foreign influence, it just doesn't seem in many respects to have grabbed the public attention in the way many thought it would.
Well, yes, and that is unfortunate, because this is one of the most serious issues facing our democracy and democracies around the world. The actions of China on the electoral process, which is the tip of the iceberg, this committee is looking at. There's elite capture. There is influence on communities to threaten them, not just for voting, but for other things too, based on their relationships still back in China. There's a real sense that an entire community of Canadians, these are Canadians we're talking about, are being intimidated, and the government has turned a blind eye to this. And this investigation now, the leaks you're talking about, shed light on part of that process, but the investigation has to go much further. It's not simply about electoral interference. It's about essentially social interference in people's lives to basically turn Canadian policy towards a favorable view to China. In academia, it's also a big issue. Funding of universities, the Confucius Institutes were a big example of that, but also research. And that research also has, we know, with the Winnipeg lab situation, some of it has been also stolen. There's, motives here that are not pure research motives. So we really, as a society, it's unfortunate. Canadians, you're right, they are not as grabbed by this issue as they should be. And that's incumbent on everyone like this, this discussion now, to bring it forward and make people say, hey, we can't tolerate this.
Mark, Tasha used the right phrase, which is the elite capture. And we have had that discussion about universities. And of course, what we're also seeing is the prevalence of the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas views on university campuses too. That really starts to sway. I've got to say, just as a Canadian of a certain age, the kinds of things that I hear being said about Jewish people in this country it's staggering to me. It's stunning that it's coming out of people's mouths and that there's not a repercussion.
Yeah, a few reactions, and I'm not sure I have a definitive or useful perspective, but I'm going to give you a couple of thoughts. I see a few intersecting problems here, and Tasha touched on one, which was with respect to the almost, there's a naivete in some ways with respect to the potentially malicious interests of those outside Canada towards Canada, and how we just aren't getting it. And that's my first reaction. The second one is to your question as it relates to the evolution of public opinion and how domestic views and opinions, not just the evolution of them in a constructive way, but how we're starting to see the systemic undermining of what we have taken for granted as our peaceful society, peace, order, and good government, and so that that really is starting to bother me when we have what are fundamentally problematic external influences starting to permeate the very grassroots, if you will, of our society, whether it's campuses or any other communities. Yeah. And then obviously the third component of that is the specific issue with respect to what is a very troubling, and this is just my instinct and an opinion, it's almost a generational shift in the views of the Israeli position and its historic position of support that the West has demonstrated kind of traditionally towards Israel, and how that's being fundamentally undermined, especially in the last several months since this conflict started. So disturbing on at least three different levels.
Yeah, I mean, young, smart people that I've had conversations with telling me that from the river to the sea doesn't have anything to do with Israel.
Shocking.
It is shocking, and it brings me back to because Margaret, you're there, and and we've seen all of the issues on the other side of the border as well about what's going on campuses in terms of education and how we are dealing with this next generation. As Mark says, are we seeing a shift in what they're being taught or how they're learning or what they come to the table with in terms of worldviews? And then I want to come back to China for a moment, but just your thoughts on that.
Yes, I remember back in the olden days when I was a university student, you're very impressionable and you want to be part of a movement and make societal change. And I think people are being caught up in that. On October 8th, I wrote an op-ed with Mehmet Todi, who's head of the Uyghur group in Canada, in support of Jewish Canadians. We felt it was important for people who aren't Jewish to speak up about this. What happened on the 7th was horrific. And now we see this big anti-Semitic backlash. It's really shocking and tragic for people who have tried to make their way in Canadian society and have done well, and now they're being put back steps because they aren't sure of their neighbors anymore, and they aren't sure of their security. And this is really a serious issue.
If we see the whole world as we seem to be through the frame of the settler countries, and we're the bad guys, and we're even told that by our leadership that this country is a bad guy. We're racist towards all sorts of groups, but of course, primarily the conversation around how we deal with the Indigenous people. Have we gone too far in trying to frame everything internationally through that same lens?
If you're asking,
yeah,
well,
you're
asking me. Yeah, I was going to say absolutely. And actually, China's been pushing this narrative. They've been pushing it on campuses. They've been pushing it because it serves their purpose. At the same time, they are oppressing the Uyghurs in their own country. They are killing them. They are harvesting their organs. It's horrific what is going on. But the narrative that the West, and especially with Canada, is vulnerable because of our Indigenous heritage. And yes, we have treated Indigenous people badly historically. There are many instances of injustice, but they amp them up. And they are amped up on campuses. They are amped up in the public discourse. The whole frame of, I reject the frame of the settler and the colonialist. I think it's an us versus them. All of us came from somewhere else. Somewhere back there, all of us came to, and we were supposed to be welcoming to refugees, to immigrants. That's what built our country. Now we're being told it's actually we're all usurpers. It turns the virtue of Canada on its head, and it makes it. We have a deficit in our military. We were talking about I think that in this broadcast as well. Why would anyone fight for Canada if we're such a bad country? Young people won't do that. So it is insidious. And yes, their minds have been twisted by TikTok, disinformation that's spread there. It's all related to the interests of other actors to move our policies in a way that's favorable to them and not favorable to us.
I mean, Margaret, that was the issue even in the time of the pandemic. I mean, we weren't allowed to say that it was, the virus came from China because that was racist. We couldn't say that the vaccine didn't work because that was, we're misframing, we're reinventing reality here. And as Tasha points out, the Chinese seem to be very adept, the Chinese Communist Party, at exploiting that.
Yes, and we see a lot of Canadian organizations, Canadian business leaders trying to make crosswalks over to China and trying to build bridges. And we, I think, have to admit that, yes, they will always want our resources, and yes, we will always want their manufactured products. But to the extent that we have to bend our values to fit whatever shape they draw for us is, I think, not a place we want to go. And China is very adept at telling other countries what they want them to do. And there's no corresponding flexibility on China's side. There's no reciprocity at all.
That was
and we just have to meet their terms.
That I found interesting about Dominic Barton's our former ambassador, and of course a long-standing Chinophile, but basically putting it back on Canadians, which is we don't understand enough about them and we need to learn more about that, and somehow that's our fault.
Well, in fact, I found his speech in the UK disturbing. I've had a lot of time for him in the past, but he was talking about China can teach us new ways of thinking. No, we've seen what the Communist Party stands for. However, he's right on one thing, and that is we don't have enough Canadians, particularly young Canadians, who understand China. Not all the good glossy things, but what are the risks, and how do you deal with those risks in business, in research, in political science? So there's something called the Canada-China Forum, which is a forum of professionals, young masters, doctoral students in AI, in business, in political science, which meets regularly across Canada. It's quite a big group of about 200 now. And they have really solid events like meetings with the representatives of Taiwan. And so that's a way, I think, of building our capabilities to understand where the risks are.
Yeah. Okay, that could go on, but I really want to get to the Ukraine question, and I want to go to Mark on that if I can at this point. We've written another check. We've said for the 400th time we have your back, but this is not going well for Ukraine. And I think the one thing we can all take away from the Tucker Carlson interview, for all the other criticisms that there might be there, which is this is about revenge. And you would know this, Mark, that you have to look at your enemy's motivation, not just their intention. And when somebody is motivated like that, this is headed in such the wrong direction.
Yeah, well, thanks for the cheery
sorry about that.
Subject matter. But fundamentally, I have to agree, intellectually, professionally, and even emotionally. Many of us have been concerned that the West would eventually start to wane. The support would continue, but that this is another example of what I characterize as strategic patience or stomach, to put it bluntly. And I'll come back to the Canadian specific element of your question in a moment. But more broadly, look, like China, Russia, they've been at this type of thing for a long time, notwithstanding the changes in personality and regime. There are fundamental ideological, historical motivations behind much, if not all, of what they do. And for us as the West to try to oversimplify that or dismiss it or whatever, I'm not going to get into that. The bottom line is they're in this for the long haul.
Yeah.
They went into it, perhaps in their own. They had some naivete with respect to some potential bravado on their part that they might be able to sort this out faster. Ukraine is obviously in an untenable situation, and I do not see an outcome where Ukraine comes out in a way which all of us in the West would like to see them victorious, and so this is problematic, and I don't have an answer. I don't have a solution, but it goes right to the heart of our Western democratic principles and who we are, and this has got NATO really troubled, not just operationally and tactically and all of the issues with respect to logistics and those things which they're consumed with, but there's a strategic nexus to this that's got a lot of the Western countries very, very troubled. And as it relates to specifically to the Canadian response, as much as it disappoints me for a variety of reasons with respect to our complete lack of capacity, the ultimate, at least we're writing a check. And I know that sounds somewhat dismissive. There's not a hell of a lot else we're capable of doing at this point, because we've allowed ourselves to get into a situation where we don't have a lot of other options. It does seem unfortunate that we're resorting to writing checks, but it almost is like an analogy of a charity. If you can't get out there and work at the soup kitchen, then you can at least send them a check to make sure they can feed people. I know that's a terrible
but
analogy, but it works.
Yeah, and you do what you can do, and as you say, we do not have the equipment. We've let our own stock go so far down that we've got nothing to send, even if there was an ability to do so. Tasha, this whole issue has shone a light on a lot of issues, energy, and whether or not we're the people that will help our neighbors out when Russia cuts off the oil, or for all sorts of reasons, the shipping, the food, the issue of food security, where Europe is on those issues, and what it might mean for us if we could develop more food and somehow do that in the face of restrictions on the use of fertilizer, all of those things. Like it's kind of put a light on some of our huge domestic inconsistencies, and also not just that we're not kind of paying our 2%, but we're not able or willing to step up to help when our allies need it, be it energy, be it LNG, be it all of those things, that it's actually put us in a questionable light as well.
Yes, and I think it actually highlights a lot of the issues Canada's been sort of snoozing along for decades, frankly. We've under the American umbrella. U.S. has been our biggest energy customer. We take for granted that we can bring products to market. I mean, yes, we have developed the trade relationship with the EU. We have developed trade relationships with individual countries as well, but it is not the same focus. And now the world, Europe wasn't a theater of war since the Second World War. I mean, right. Bosnia, yes, we saw those conflicts, but the main focus of conflicts was not Europe. Now it is again. And it brings to mind, Canada's role in the past. We were extremely strong players for our size anyway, in World War I and World War II. We stood with our European allies in that sense of democracies, of commonality. And, the danger is now, because we're so wrapped up in the more American universe, if that universe goes to where Donald Trump wants to take it, it's very isolationist. It's not even clear if he'd protect us. We don't pay our 2%. You know,
Right.
would he say to Putin, okay, go, it's fine, you can attack Canada, they're on our border, we don't care. It's so ridiculous. But the very fact that the US risks becoming incredibly isolationist, abandoning its European allies for a very transactional view of the world. You know, everyone's got their territory. It's very much a business approach, businessman's approach. You know, Putin gets his space, Xi Jinping gets his space, and North and America will take its space. Everyone just closes off. Well, where's Canada in that? You're right. We have not developed any kind of multilateral relationship that we should have with other nations in case our relationship with the US goes south. And we have to really think about that.
Well, and yes, and I think as his former ambassador said, trash talking Trump at this point may not be helpful to staying under that umbrella while we figure out what else to do. It goes to the point, Margaret, that Mark Norman was making about we have a certain naivete about so many of these issues that somehow just the rhetorical flourishes will work. And on a kind of a related point, you see anybody even asking simple questions about, are we doing security checks on people that we're letting into our country? That becomes an outrage. That becomes something we can't talk about either. Is our naivete going to put us further out on an island all by ourselves here? Even our Five Eyes partners are kind of say, we'll call you later and give you an update.
Well, it's interesting that you use that word. The Chinese call us Han, which is first tone, which in Mandarin, which means open and easy to work with. But behind our backs, they laugh because the other meaning of that exact word and tone is foolish and naive. And so that's how they see us operating in our joint ventures in China. You know, on the issue of defense spending, we aren't making our 2%. We should be because, you know, even in our own Arctic, we're at risk from China on all kinds of levels. I've done a lot of work on China in the Arctic. It's very concerning. But we're also supporting Ukraine, and they're at war. I would say 2% is when everything's nice and quiet and going well. 3% is what we should be doing for Ukraine. And we're not doing it. And, you know, the Americans, I think to some extent are right to call us on it. So we don't just sit back in that context. We actually should step up. And that's not happening.
I just want to follow up on that with the Arctic, because this is an issue that A, I've seen, and B, I care about. I mean, the Russians are poking us every day, putting their planes over the border. And we have quite willingly over the decades allowed the Chinese to go in and map the floor, which is where all these valuable resources were going to be. Are we just, I mean, naive doesn't even seem to come close. This is really dangerous for our country and the access that it gives to America as well.
Right. And China has been trying to sell its role in the Arctic as being open and science, and you know they just want to help. They call themselves a near Arctic nation. If Russia hadn't been kind of pushed out of the Arctic Council over the last couple of years, you know, they could very well have done something to get China in as a full member. That's been my big concern. But the Arctic Council members have been meeting by themselves without Russia. But China has been filling the gap. Russia's been putting a lot of resources into Ukraine, so China has stepped up to help in the Arctic. And they've had joint military exercises. They've got a lot of research and development in a joint lab with Russia. As you say, they've been mapping the seabed of the Arctic, of the Northwest Passage, and we've allowed them to go through on the ship. Each ship that goes through, there's a big area that the Canadians are not allowed onto. There's an Inuit and a navigator on those ships. Mark Norman would know about all this. But they aren't allowed to go into this big black box. And I believe that's where they're mapping the seabed of the Northwest Passage. So soon they won't need the navigator. They'll know where they're going. And buying up gold mines along the coast there is just a good strategy to find themselves a little port that they can make into a port for themselves.
Okay, Mark, now it's your turn to tell us a depressing story because you do know about this.
Yes.
Okay, well, first of all, sadly, it warms my heart that Tasha and Margaret are so passionate about these issues, and that they are highlighting what are some very serious strategic vulnerabilities, both, I say cultural, and I don't mean that in the vernacular. I mean in terms of our security culture or lack thereof, and institutional issues. And then there's obviously capability and capacity challenges. I just put not an anecdote per se, but let's not forget that part of the reason China is mapping the sea bottom is so that they can operate their own submarines in the Arctic. Okay, and you don't do that just because you can. You do it because you have a very specific strategic interest. And this goes back to the previous conversation and something both Tasha and Margaret have pointed. Look, they're in this to win it. I don't know what winning looks like. I mean, I could wax on for hours, but the bottom line is that they're not doing these things out of a sense of scientific benevolence, as Margaret rightly pointed out. So there are some very specific military applications to this. If you want to operate a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine in a bastion in the Arctic Ocean or anywhere else in the world, you need to know what the bottom topography of that body of water looks like. We don't know. I remember vividly a story that I can't tell, but it involved a former prime minister on the bridge of a Canadian ship, where I pointed out to him during a visit that the charts we were operating on were originally produced by Captain Cook. Yes, that same Captain Cook. And that the Russians were actively mapping the bottom of the Arctic, and we didn't have a clue. So it is beyond naivete. We are absolute Luddites, if not buffoons, when it comes to some of these issues, and this is just one example.
Mm-hmm.
Tasha?
I would echo that. The power of the Chinese Navy is something that's, I think, underreported here in Canada, but in the South China Sea, they have been incredibly active. They consistently harass Philippine ships and the atolls where they have military installations. They are expansionists, and their Navy is incredibly powerful. And yes, the submarines will be part of that. The issue with the Arctic is really it's the back gate to America. It's not even Canada's just sort of in the way there. We're there. We're the door. They can open that door. Then they can threaten the U.S. They are in a position to exert force. They also already have a port, the Belt and Road Initiative port that was established on the west coast of Canada. On the east coast, they have bought up a lot of land in Prince Edward Island and established a allegedly Buddhist monastery, but it's not really. If you dig into it, it's a project that many people see as the precursor to a military base where they train young people. They train monks, in quotes, but these monks are not necessarily all learning meditation. So there's a really big interest in ports, in seafaring, in terms of their military strategy. The Arctic's part of that, but we got to be also there's three coasts, coast to coast to coast in Canada, and they're on all three. So we have to pay attention to this. We are naive, unfortunately.
Margaret, so many people, and I agree with 1,000% with what's just been said, that this is about hegemony. This is about they are going to be the superpower, and that is their intent. Every bit as much as Russia's trying to get back to the power days, the glory days of the Soviet Union. So if that's the intent, there's also another string of stories, and I could read you headlines here from today, that their population is diminishing, their stock market's in trouble. There's a whole lot of economic issues that they're now facing, which we're also not dealing with, and understanding what the implications of that might be and why they may be stepping it all up on the other front. Knowing full well internally they're in trouble economically and population wise.
They are. And what that's driving them to is more and more control and surveillance. And the problems they've got include about 25% youth unemployment, which includes all the university grads. Wow. That's really concerning in terms of potential for protests, and that's throughout society, and that's messing with the dream that the Communist Party, has sold the citizens of China. And they're not coming through on the dream. And in fact, they're further decoupling from the West. Here in the West, we talk about, we can't decouple from China. They're so big, they're so important. But it's China that's decoupling from us by keeping their data to themselves, by really heavily screening what research collaboration can happen and what information gets outside about that. They've just brought in an Article 23 of the Hong Kong Constitution, which is very, very heavy-handed on what could happen if someone, an academic or somebody in a think tank, wrote something at all negative about Hong Kong or China, and that they can go to jail for 2 to 5 years. If it's more serious, longer. These are all things that they're doing so that they have a better feeling that they can control the population. And, one of the really concerning things on the horizon is that with that kind of economic stagnation that they're going through, relative to where it was, 10 years ago, they could join together the citizenry around the nationalism of bringing Taiwan back into the fold. And boy, anybody with a business interest in China at that point will really have to get out quickly. There will be hordes getting out, and that's a really significant risk. Not to mention the military repercussions for Taiwan, for the U.S., and for Canada, because we're an ally.
Well, and it brings us back to the foreign interference, which is why we need to know more about the operatives that are here in this country functioning and collecting that data and messaging both ways.
Right. And this is where there's a lot of concern about the Hague Commission. This was a commission after the Johnston review that was put in place to try to get to the root of the electoral interference, but the government has tried very hard to circumscribe its role to just focus on the elections and democratic institutions, rather than the broader areas of interference and intimidation that the diaspora have been talking about for years, and that they really need help on. They thought that this interference commission was going to help, and instead, one of the big groups on Hong Kong didn't even bother to enter because they could see that the writing was on the wall, that they wouldn't get a fair hearing, and that 3 particular politicians would be in a position of getting access to all their secret information and cross-examining them. And then the Uyghurs stepped back a couple of weeks ago when they saw the same thing, having put in an appeal to the commissioner. She's written some soft language into the procedures that they could be a witness, but just using their initials, not their names. But that's not what they wanted at all. So I can't see a third do-over by this government. And we'll see what the Hague Commission produces. But I think, one of the things we've seen in it is that there's no one on any of the staff of that commission, any of the lawyers or policy advisors who has any depth on China. And Madame Hague herself, her job as a lawyer was to advise on any companies that were at a risk of their reputational risk, like maybe a government perhaps. And one of the senior policy advisors, his role has been to defend those who have been accused of abrogation of national security rules. So, you can't make this stuff up. It's just really, it seems incredible.
It comes back to the point I mentioned at the beginning, and I would like to hear a final word from all of you on this. And I think it was attributed to Philip Cross, who was writing about our place in the world with all of the things we've touched on today, and that we've gone from swaggering to staggering across the international stage. Our reputation, not great, our influence waning, and our relevance really in question. Mark Norman, thoughts?
Yeah. So, some of the issues we've touched on, I think, are good examples of this last sort of closing point. The first observation I would make is that we are victims of our own rhetoric, and we need to be very, very careful. What we say, how we say things, and obviously that our actions are consistent with our rhetoric. And this isn't a political observation. People, your listeners can draw their own conclusions, but that gap has broadened significantly, and where it hasn't broadened, the rhetoric has put us into places that we don't want to be, and it's limited our options, and it's really constrained our ability to pursue our interests, as we've basically tied ourselves in knots trying to say the right things, and we just don't know how to act. The issues of capacity, the issues of national will, the issues of naivete that's resonated in our conversation here. Not to oversimplify this, but I just don't think we know who we want to be and when we grow up. And we're facing, and I think Tasha really nailed this earlier, we are facing an increasingly troubling world, not just because of the geostrategic issues that we've touched on, but because that we have our growth and our prosperity and our security for the better part of the last century, certainly the bulk of our life as a nation, has been pretty much dependent on one of two massive empires. And we don't know how to behave in a world where one or both of those empires is either A, no longer in place to look after us, or B, has chosen to set us adrift in our own sea of rhetoric, if I could sound poetic. So those are my sad thoughts on your closing
I
question.
mentioned at the beginning, and it stuck in my head, this British military leader basically saying we have to start talking about citizen armies in face of the crumbling of not only our national institutions, but our international institutions. Look at the state of the UN at this point, and the questions about all of its internal organizations. I mean, this is, when you hear somebody, I mean, do you think that's crazy, or do you think people are actually having that discussion, Mark?
It's not crazy. It speaks to, I think, two fundamental problems that Western militaries are trying to come to grips with, especially in light of the challenges in Ukraine. One, there's almost a paradox here. You are a come as you are military in this day and age. So if you don't have what you need when things start, your ability and capacity to generate either people, equipment, ammunition, whatever, stocks, is extremely constrained. And we're seeing that play out right now. And the other part of that paradox, of course, is the fact that you need to have the mechanisms in place to mobilize in a way which we have not really thought about, as Tasha mentioned, for the better part of half a century, because we haven't had to deal with those issues. So whether that's the right answer, I don't know, but at least we need to have those types of
Those
conversations.
conversations. So Tasha, swaggering to staggering, your final thoughts?
I will build on what Mark said. I agree with a lot of what he said. I will disagree with one point, which is we don't know what we want to be. I think this government, unfortunately, knows what it wants to be. It wants to be elected, and it has allowed domestic politics to impact foreign policy. So you've seen that on the issues around China. You've seen that on the issues around Sikh extremism and Sikh nationalism. You've seen it on the Israel-Palestine or Israel-Hamas conflict. Consistently, this government looks which way the wind is blowing for its votes from different communities within Canada and says, okay, that's going to determine how we stand as a country. It's very problematic. We are a country built by immigration, but we cannot allow foreign conflicts to dictate our values and where we stand on principle, because there are common principles running through these things. Defense of democracy, defense of human rights, defense of the very freedoms people came to Canada for. And this government's been compromising them consistently by taking stances in the public square internationally with an eye to what ridings are we going to lose in Mississauga, right? And it's very disturbing because, you know, ethnic politics, as it used to be called in Quebec when I, was a young'un and was involved with the Progressive Conservative Party, yes, that played out all the time, but it didn't affect foreign policy the way it is now. And that to me is one of the most troubling things that I see.
Now, that's a very interesting point. Final thought, Margaret.
Yes, well, thanks to Mark and Tasha for your points, because it very nicely sets up what I was going to say. A few weeks ago, Minister Jolie gave a big speech where she talked about the future directions for foreign affairs and diplomacy. And she talked about the new thrust of her department, which is pragmatic diplomacy. Pragmatic diplomacy, to me, says unprincipled, unplanned, and whatever somebody thinks about on that particular day. And it's very disturbing to me that we wouldn't have a principled foreign policy. That's really surprising. I would like to see us spend less time on gender diplomacy and more time on defense and security and really serious foreign policy issues.
Yeah, we're living in a very troubled spot this time. Well, I'm going to say thank you because it was an amazing and wonderful and insightful conversation. But to Mark's point, we're all going to go and have to have a drink just to calm ourselves down here. Don't do that at all. Margaret McCuaig-Johnston, Tasha Kheiriddin, Admiral Mark Norman, thank you so much for your insights and kind of situating where we are and some of the things we really, really seriously need to be thinking about these days. So then that's over to those of us that live on Parliament Hill, for better or worse. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You all again soon. And I also want to thank all of you for listening and watching. That is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. And we'll see you soon.